Hello, everybody. Hi, we're glad you're here with us for On Course with Liberal Arts. Today's topic is Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bethany Albertson. Dr. Albertson is an author, American political psychologist, and associate professor of political science in the College of Liberal Arts Government Department. Her work explores public opinion, political attitudes, and persuasion. Her current research relies on surveys and experiments to examine the effect of religious appeals in American politics and the relationship between emotion and cognition. Please send your questions to the speaker via the chat function. We will answer as many questions as possible in the last half of the webinar. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Albertson.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share some research with you. I also have to note that I should update that bio because my current research, although I would love to talk about religious appeals and their persuasive effects, my current research is emotions, anxiety in particular, and most recently attitudes towards elections. And I'll share some of that with you today. Typically, I like to start anxiety talks with lots of threatening imagery and examples from political advertisements that were designed to amp up anxiety. And let's face it, it's 2020, we've got a pandemic, we've got an election, and nobody needs that. And so what I have for you instead, I hope, is a very calming background for this talk. And but that's not to say that the talk will be calming itself. What I hope to leave you with is an understanding of emotion in our politics. In particular, I'll show you some work I've done related to anxiety around a public health crisis, which is, a little relevant now, and attitudes towards elections. And I think the through line you'll find, and the one I see in the research I'm presenting today, is that emotion matters in politics, and in our current context, partisanship shapes the way that emotion is experienced and the impact emotion has in our politics. And so the through line will be emotion matters, and partisanship does too, and partisanship really matters in this 2020 context. Another through line I want to leave you with is that elite messaging matters a lot, and you'll see that emerge in this talk as well. But let me give you an outline for what I'll show you today. I'm just going to give you kind of a sprinkling of research I've done, a few of the studies that show you how a political psychologist approaches these questions, and I think brings some interesting evidence to bear on really important contemporary issues. So I'll start with some research that my co-author, Shana Kushner-Guderian, and I did about anxious politics. And this is where we get our title for the talk, is the name of our book. And in our book, Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World, we had a couple of studies in that book about a public health crisis. And so I want to share with you what we know about anxiety and public health under normal circumstances. And I put normal in quotes there because we're not in that context right now. As an academic, we're typically in the world of saying how important and how relevant our research is. And in 2020, Shana and I are in this position of saying, well, here's what our research said about how public health triggers anxiety and how that changes people's politics. And it doesn't seem to hold now. So we have this awkward, we're not as relevant as we might hope, but it's important, I think, to show where we're different from where our research was. So I'll show you some work on anxiety around COVID-19 and explain how it's acting in a more politically polarized context. And then, if that isn't threatening enough, I want to share with you some research I did about uncertainty regarding the 2020 election. And so I want to give you two kind of threats to think about in this talk today, COVID-19 and the election, and that's why I had to change the background to be a little more calming because it's an unsettling time, I know. To start with, let's situate the work in terms of anxiety. Anxiety is an emotion. It's characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, physical changes like sweaty palms and increased blood pressure. When we're talking about emotions, we're talking about physiological reactions. They're in your body. And in the case of anxiety, it's deeply uncomfortable. When we're feeling anxious, we're motivated to resolve that anxiety. And so our argument in the book is that that uncomfortable feeling of anxiety is going to lead to a variety of coping mechanisms. And in our book, we trace out anxiety causes us to seek out information, and it causes us to seek out particular types of information. Anxiety causes us to put our trust in actors, right? When we're anxious, it can be very calming to have faith in people in power. And so we trace that out as well. And we also show how anxiety can boost support for policies that are supposed to protect us. Let me give you a little bit more context for thinking about how our argument plays out. In our book, we conceptualize threats in two different ways. Some things are unframed threats. Everybody sees them as threatening. You don't have to listen to a particular news channel or have a particular political identity to feel threatened if there's a flood in your neighborhood, for instance. We also conceived of a disease outbreak as something that would be an unframed threat. In our book, we look at 4 different threats, and we tried to compare across framed threats. And this is where we argue about whether there's a harm and the causes of the harm, and whether the harms, might be proximate or later on, and who's responsible and what to do about these things. In our book, the framed threats we looked at were immigration and climate change. Now, if you're on the right, you might say, no, immigration, that's something I feel threatened about right now. It's objective, it's real. But somebody on the left would argue, likewise, somebody on the left would say, climate change is an unframed threat. That's a real threat that's affecting us right now. But of course, other people would disagree. And so we distinguish between threats that have more partisan contours and threats that everyone feels. What typically characterizes these threats that are unframed is that there's imminent bodily harm. And so to tease this apart further, on 9/11, a terrorist attack was an unframed threat. Everybody felt anxious. Go a year or 2 or 3 out, as our response to terrorist attacks and the war on terror gets politicized and takes on partisan contours, it becomes more of a framed threat. But when that bodily harm is imminent, it's unframed. The distinction is important because in the context of unframed threats, we hypothesized that anxiety would cause us to put our trust in experts. In the context of framed threats, well, who the expert is debatable. And who we see as an expert depends on partisanship, both of the individual and of the elite. Okay, so I want to show you 2 studies we did that are in the book around public health threats. And the first one, so here's the idea in our studies. We manipulate anxiety either over H1N1 or a fictional smallpox outbreak. These manipulations raise anxiety in a treatment condition, and then we measure trust. Who do people trust in a variety of actors to deal with the source, to deal with the threat? I want to show you a bottom-up manipulation we did, and then I'll show you a newspaper manipulation we did. The bottom-up manipulation was a study we did with UT undergraduates, where we asked them, we'd like you to take a moment to reflect on H1N1. This is 2010. Swine flu. What makes you feel worried about H1N1 virus? Please describe how you felt as vividly and as much detail as possible. So one group's asked to list their worries and what makes them anxious about H1N1. The other group is asked just, what do you think about it? When you think about it, please list what comes to mind. The idea here is you're holding thinking about H1N1 constant while you're amping up the worry in the treatment condition. And we go through rounds and rounds of pretesting in order to show this really does change anxiety levels in one group versus the other. So what do we find? After we have one group more worried about H1N1 than the other group, we ask them about their attitudes towards government and trust. And what we find is, you see in the green bar there, the group that was asked to list their worries about H1N1, 35% of them were very confident in the federal government's ability to address the problem. In the control group, it's 17%. So what we see here is anxiety over H1N1 caused these students to put more confidence in the government. The difference for the president in this study, you see 28% versus 26%. It's a very small difference. And in this study, it's not statistically significant. There weren't enough subjects in the study in order to tease that apart. But it's also consistent with our priors on this, that when we're anxious about a public health threat, the government as the whole, or a agency within the government, would be where people would put their trust, not in a partisan actor. And I'll have more on that in a moment. So we also teased apart different actors within and outside of government. Who do you trust? And these are differences between treatment and control again. And you'll see that anxiety over H1N1 caused people to increase their level of trust in the CDC, the FDA, HHS, WebMD as a source, and their personal doctor. We didn't see significant effects on Obama or the Surgeon General or friends. Now you might say the Surgeon General. Surgeon General is interesting in this study because Surgeon General is both a political appointee and a medical expert. In a further study, we teased apart whether the Surgeon General was framed as a political appointee or as a medical expert. What we found in that study was that when you're anxious about a public health threat, you'll put your trust in the Surgeon General when the Surgeon General is framed as a medical expert. If you emphasize the fact the Surgeon General is a political appointee, we don't turn to that person in the case of a medical crisis. And so that reaffirms our argument here that it's medical expertise rather than politics that should matter in the case of a public health threat. So another study I'll show you, and this is a newspaper study, another way we manipulate anxiety over a public health threat. This is a newspaper story that talks about a smallpox outbreak. In this study, we hold the description of smallpox constant, and we manipulate whether the smallpox outbreak is happening now in Ohio or happened 25 years ago. So in both conditions, people are reading about a smallpox outbreak and how horrifying that is. It's just in one group, it's happening, and the other group, it's the anniversary of it having happened. And so for the group where the threat is happening now, the anxiety level is significantly higher. Okay, similar findings here. When we compare smallpox past to smallpox present, these are the differences in who trusts each a great deal. The first thing I want to show you, though, before we look at differences, we put relevant and irrelevant actors in this study because we were interested. When we're anxious, do we just indiscriminately trust, or is our trust driven towards those people who are best able to handle the source of the problem, right? Who are best able to handle the threat, which is why in this study we have relevant governmental actors like the CDC, HHS, and completely irrelevant actors like the IRS and the Fed. Sensibly, I like to give subjects credit when they're making political sense. They are not putting their trust in the IRS or the Fed. And then they didn't put their trust in Oprah either, which was just like a question of mine because sometimes she ventures into public health issues. Where people put their trust and where trust went up when they're anxious about a public health crisis is, again, CDC, HHS, FDA, and the DHS. And this gives us some confidence that it's expertise that is that people are drawn to when they're anxious. There aren't effects on doctor. This could be a ceiling effect. It was already so high, it can get higher. Importantly, across our public health studies, these effects are not conditioned by partisanship. Whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican or a political independent, everybody is feeling more anxious in the public health threat conditions, and everybody is putting their trust in relevant actors. Okay, so we have a book, we have studies, we have an argument, and now we have a public health crisis again. Here's the numbers I drew from today's New York Times. We're currently at 220,000 deaths in this country. We have a case rate that appears to be going up again. What does our research have to say about anxiety in a public health crisis and who people ought to trust? Shana and I wrote a piece for the Washington Post showing what our research said. Our research said that political actors should put their public health officials front and center, and that the partisan actors should stay out of it. And that's not what happened. And I'm going to show you a deeply partisan response to a public health threat. In general, we know that partisanship conditions whether people are concerned about whether they'll get COVID, whether they may spread it to others. And these are partisan differences that grow between April and June. And then, is the threat, is the increase because this is getting more dangerous, or is it simply because there's more testing? Republicans are much more likely to say that the increase in cases is because of more testing, and Democrats are more likely to say it's not just the tests that are happening, it's we're actually having more cases. Here's some research that Shana did with some other co-authors that I think is really relevant here. You see that Democrats are more likely to engage in a variety of health behaviors, and this exists across March, April, June. In some cases, the differences aren't significant, right? In terms of stopping religious attendance or visiting the doctor. But you can see that Democrats are more likely to avoid contact with others, wear a mask, seek information on COVID, etc. And then in terms of the policies people support, there are deep partisan differences. Republicans are more likely to say we need to ban entry, whereas Democrats are more likely to agree with paid leave, free testing, canceling everything. Now, I don't want to exaggerate these partisan effects. One of the findings in this research that made me feel better was on delaying elections. You'll see in March, there was some consideration from every partisan group for delaying elections. And this is, remember, is at the start of the outbreak where a number of states are delaying their primaries. As we get further along and we think about the general election, support for delaying elections went down, and it went down across the board, regardless of partisanship. This matters. This matters. Lots of people in the country are voting by mail. At least 83% of the country can cast ballots by mail. But if partisanship is shaping who's concerned about COVID, it's also shaping the protective actions they want to take. And so Democrats are going to be more likely to engage in voting by mail in many places, not in Texas, of course. Well, maybe among older people, but the 65 and unders, we're making our ways to the polls. Here we see partisan differences in more recently for delaying elections. You see a slight difference in terms of Republicans being more likely to support delaying elections. You see stark partisan differences in who's going to vote by mail, with Democrats more likely to vote by mail. And so I like to note that in terms of those of you who are watching elections, there's going to be differences by mode of voting in terms of when votes come in. Okay, why don't we see strong effects for anxiety about COVID, this major public health threat that's changing our country? Partisanship. Who do we trust to provide us with accurate information on COVID? If you're a Democrat, you're more likely to trust Joe Biden. If you're a Republican, you're more likely to trust Donald Trump. We're seeing this in such partisan filters. It's worth noting that independents are more likely to trust Joe Biden than Donald Trump. And this is consistent with what we're seeing in terms of who they support in the election. But this partisan filter that's affecting how we're getting this threatening information and who we're trusting in the face of it. It's what I keep coming back to when I see results like this. This is the 538 tracker. And if you look between March 2020 and October to today, October 20, I just did this snapshot. There is not a lot of change in these numbers. Right, we go from a slightly smaller difference between the two candidates to what we have today is it's a 10-point, they say, margin. And a lot has happened. A lot has happened between March 2020 and today. And this just, I think, supports this idea that there are such strong partisan filters on the way people are seeing the world and experiencing this threat. So what Shana and I would have said at the time of our book, that a public health disaster like we're experiencing would have a profound political effect in terms of who people trust and the behaviors we engage in, it hasn't carried out that way in 2020. Okay. So the main points from that piece of the talk was that worry over public health threat typically boosts support in government and particularly experts, nonpartisan actors. But today it's a highly polarized climate and partisanship affects who's worried about COVID-19, our preferred political responses, and who we trust. Few voters, though, are up for grabs, and we've seen a fairly steady partisan split in this election. I have some time, so I want to share with you some research that's about another thing a lot of us find deeply unsettling. It's an emotional election. I've been doing some research on attitudes towards elections and faith in the electoral process because it's something that I think matters a lot. I started working with a graduate student at UT Austin on how people react to vote rigging allegations. Now, if you're paying attention to elite messaging on the election, and if you were paying attention in 2016, there was a lot of speculation about whether or not Donald Trump would accept a loss. And he said things along these lines. I'll look at it at the time. I'll keep you in suspense. He said afterwards, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. And he pretty consistently messages about people trying to steal the elections. Here's one tweet. I could have given you a whole collage of Trump tweets about stealing elections. So this was November 10th in the 2018 midterms. They're trying to steal two big elections in Florida. We're watching closely. And we again have in 2020 more rhetoric about attempts to steal an election. So we were interested in when politicians talk about stealing an election, what effect does that have? What effect does that have in our emotions? As an emotions researcher, I was interested in how people were reacting to this language. And then what does it mean for support for democratic norms? I'm going to show you some of the research we did. This is work with Kimberly Geiler, who's a PhD candidate in the government department. We asked, what's the effect of conspiratorial rhetoric about vote rigging on emotions and support for democratic norms? And as you might imagine, we're going to show some pretty big effects, but they're all conditioned by partisanship, or excuse me, they're mostly conditioned by partisanship. And there's an interesting difference here. So let me walk you through how we did the study and what our results were. In this study, we randomly assigned participants to read one of three news excerpts. One group read that the election is secure. So they have a security expert, Daniel Miller, who says it's incredibly unlikely that hackers who wish to compromise the election will be able to exploit our voter databases. This is letting people know that our electoral systems are secure. In another group, people read that the US voting system is vulnerable to fraud. They read that the Russians, who will do anything to defeat Hillary Clinton, will exploit the vulnerability of our voter databases. In the third group, they read that the Democrats were rigging the election. The Democrats who will do anything to defeat Donald Trump, to exploit the vulnerability of our databases. Without stricter voting ID laws, the election could be rigged in favor of Hillary. Okay, to talk a bit about the asymmetry between these conditions. In one group, you have the Russians rigging the election. In one group, you have the Democrats rigging the election. We wanted to remind people of the rhetoric that was out there in the political world. Democrats were afraid that there was a Russian conspiracy to rig the election. Republicans were afraid there was a Democratic conspiracy to rig the election. Now, we could have held the actors more comparable for Democrats to read, or for everyone in one condition to read about Republicans rigging the election, and everybody to read in another condition about Democrats rigging the election. But in 2016, those weren't the narratives that were available to people. So rather than hold things symmetrical in terms of the manipulation, we wanted to do symmetrical stimuli in terms of what we expected would resonate with people. Important to note, as a political psychologist who does these sorts of experiments, you may be thinking, you're telling people false information in the context of an experiment. Aren't you worried about the effects that has on people? Yes, absolutely, 100% I am. We are. Couple of things to note. We debriefed. After they participate in the study, they learn the purpose of the study, why we did it, and they get the invitation to contact us if they want to talk about it, and we give them the correct information. The other reason I'm not terribly concerned about this one is that over 40% of the sample in this election, it was done the day before the election, in this study, had already voted. And so I'm not worried that we made them less likely to vote. We also looked at the effect of these 3 conditions on people's intention to vote among the 60% who hadn't voted yet in the sample. And there were no statistical differences. Being in one condition versus another wasn't related to whether or not somebody was going to show up and vote. Okay, so what did we find? First thing is that we ran a manipulation check. Do you think that the election is going to be secure or not? Or do you think that the article said the election is going to be secure or not? And regardless of one's partisanship, people understood when they read a Democrats are rigging the election story or they read a Russians are rigging the election story, they got that the article was telling you that the election wouldn't be as secure. So the manipulation check showed that we all understood, regardless of our partisanship, what the article was saying. But when we asked people, how likely is it that you think there'll be fraud in the election? Democrats only think there will be more fraud in the election when it hurts their candidate, when the Russians are rigging the election. Republicans only think there will be more fraud in the election when it hurts their candidate, when the Democrats are rigging the election. And so this is the first piece of this partisan motivated reasoning story we're sharing here, is that we only think that the conspiracy is true or likely when it victimizes us. Emotion effects. My goodness, after how many studies in the book where we try to trigger emotional effects to all sorts of upsetting things, I've never seen such strong emotion effects in a study. Regardless of partisanship, you'll see the Democrats here, when they read about vote rigging compared to the election's secure category or condition, they get sad, they get anxious, they get disgusted, they get angry, they're less enthusiastic, and they're less hopeful. These are really strong emotion effects, and we show the same for Republicans. The only asymmetry Republicans have is that there's no distinction on anxiety when they read about Russians rigging, but on the whole, right, Republicans are also more disgusted, angry, sad, less enthusiastic, and less hopeful when they read these vote rigging allegations, regardless of who's doing the rigging. But perhaps most importantly, we ask for support for democratic norms after reading the stories. How confident are they that their votes will be accurately cast and counted? If your preferred candidate ends up losing, would you accept the election as legitimate? And how important is it to you that the losing candidate publicly acknowledges the winner? And just show you these effects, again, we see this asymmetry where Democrats become less confident in the election when the interference is hurting their candidate, not when it's helping their candidate. And vice versa for the Republicans. They become less confident in the election when Democrats are rigging the election. And they look a little less confident when Russians are, though that difference isn't statistically significant. The next one I'll show you is the one true asymmetrical finding, or principled partisan finding, as I like to call it, where both Democrats and Republicans become less willing to accept the results when the Russians are rigging. But Democrats aren't any less likely to accept the results when the Democrats are rigging. And of course, the Republican respondents are. This could be because both the Russians and Democrats are outside actors to the Republican respondents. But here, and this maybe is the more troubling finding, is that when asked if it's important for the loser to concede, Republicans are less likely to say it's important for the loser to concede the election when Democrats are rigging the election, when they read that Democrats are rigging the election. And of course, conceding an election, losers consent, is an important part of our democratic small d tradition in this country. And so this is a finding that we found a bit alarming. And so the bigger picture is that we also looked for support for the candidates, broader trust in political institutions, and we didn't find effects, but we found dramatic effects on emotions, and we found support for the hypothesis that it would change our support for democratic small d norms, but those are conditioned by partisanship. The through line across the studies I'm talking to you about today and the research, emotion's important in politics, but both of these threats, COVID-19 and threats to election integrity, they show how partisanship conditions our responses. And I also think they show that elite messaging, the ways that we talk about a public health threat, the ways we talk about our elections, it matters for the American public. Thank you.
Our first question is, did you find the suppression or rigging motivated people to vote? Did they have more determination to endure delays and other hardships in order to vote?
Yeah, I didn't. And it's something we looked for. It's possible that in my study, I didn't have enough participants, since 40% of the people had said they already voted due to early voting. Among the 60%, I didn't find effects. And that could be that the people in my study were participators already. They were particularly likely to participate, and so I couldn't see a backlash effect. There are a number of studies, good studies, that show that threatening people's voting rights or threats to voting can increase voter turnout. There's a paper by Valentino and co-authors showing that one of the reasons you don't see a negative relationship between voter ID and turnout is because some people are less likely to vote when there's voter ID restrictions, people for whom it's difficult to get the ID, et cetera. But you also, with voter ID, really anger people. and those angry people are more likely to vote. So it's a counter mobilization idea. And it's part of what might be going on in Texas right now. We've all seen high turnout in the election so far in early voting, particularly if you look at like Harris County. It's amazing, right? And I tell my students, this could be a mirage. It could be that people are just getting voting out of the way and that our numbers won't actually be higher when all is said and done. It could be it's a really important election, or it is. It could also be a backlash effect where people perceive threats to their voting rights and that makes them angry. And in terms of emotions, I study anxiety. Anxiety is really good for getting people to trust and getting people to learn, look around and get new information. It's not a good predictor of who's going to vote, whether you're anxious or not. The major emotional predictor of who's going to vote is anger. And so when, people try to make it more difficult for others to vote. And again, this is something we see through partisan filters, I know, but that anger can be a really strong motivator to get out there and vote.
Okay. Makes sense. Next question. What effect does the politicization of health authorities have on trust in those organizations and in individuals in those organizations?
It's really scary to me. The politicization of public health officials has meant that, Dr. Fauci, for instance, is still a very trusted individual in this country, but now there are partisan contours to that trust. Now, Republicans are less likely to trust messaging from Dr. Fauci than Democrats are. And I think that's scary. I think it's scary to have partisanship shaping scientific information. It's going to be, I think it's scary right now in terms of the behaviors people are engaging in to keep ourselves safe. But, to also give you something else to worry about, when we have a vaccine and that vaccine gets rolled out, they're going to need to hopefully try to take it away from partisanship as much as they can, in order to get it to work and cover people. I would tell the Trump administration, I would tell Biden if he wins, keep your partisan people out of things and put your public health experts front and center whenever possible.
Advice. Next question. In an effort to not both sides this argument, aren't there legitimate reasons why we should be worried about a foreign power meddling in the election?
Yeah. Yes. That's my short, cute answer is yes, absolutely. What does it mean, though, for the average citizen when we talk about electoral threats? We should absolutely be worried about foreign meddling in our election. If you read the Senate report on this, it happened. It is a real threat that this country faces. What does it mean, though, for for everyday citizens? What can we do? I do some other research on conveying election threats to the mass public and how we do it in a way that leaves people feeling like they still matter, they still have a voice in politics. This is some research I did with colleagues in communication who study these sorts of, like, how do you message? There's a potential threat to the election, but I don't want you to throw up your hands and say, oh, well, then it doesn't matter. What should I do? What can I do? And what our research has found is that when we talk about threats, we need to pair them with solutions. And so we can talk about how there are attempts to meddle in our elections, but we should also talk about how there is a decentralized electoral system in the United States that can help insulate it from threat, right? The fact that our elections are run by states and local actors make it a really difficult system for an outside actor to intervene in. We can talk about the dedicated public servants who work in our states and localities to make these elections work. We can even talk about actors within the Department of Homeland Security who take this issue really, really seriously. And they partner with people from both political parties. They're both Democrats and Republicans who recognize that this is a really important problem and that we need people to be trusting in our elections. And so I don't mean to both sides election interference, but I do also want to caution that the way we talk about that can, and that's part of the plan, right? When Russia decides to sow discord in our elections and make people feel uncertain, part of the hope there is that people just throw up their hands and say, oh, it doesn't matter who I vote for. It doesn't matter that I engage. And so aside from the partisans in Washington, the more public figures, there are dedicated civil servants taking on these threats. And so far, we see really good support for, the idea that at the local level, these elections are going as planned. People are voting and trusting. At the local level, what we worry about more are things like long lines, right? Closed voting places, the accessibility of how you get to these are things we can do things about as citizens, right? We can campaign for change on those issues. And people are, right, for accessibility of voting and making voting easier. And so that's what I try to talk to people about.
Thank you. What effect does unbiased media have?
Oh, what is this unbiased media you talk about? It sounds lovely. The difficulty is, of course, that nobody sees unbiased media. Now, there's a scale, right? You can say some things are really, really, really partisan, and some things try to not be partisan or try to present a more balanced view to things. But as our both sides question conveyed, right? Sometimes in trying to convey multiple sides of things, you miss accuracy in your reporting. There's a lot of ideas I'm throwing at you for the truth is that as we have more and more and more media options, people have more ability to self-select into their own, kind of sphere of information. We can go to our little liberal bubble or a little conservative bubble and just sort of stay there. What I try to tell students to do is to look around, to try to take in a variety of news sources. But I don't have hope that there's a perfect unbiased source out there that we could all turn to to save us. There's this thing called the hostile media effect, and it means that liberals think that the media is against them and conservatives think the media is against them. The idea that we'd all agree on a neutral or unbiased media source is really difficult.
Getting more difficult, probably. In Get Out the Vote efforts, potential voters are encouraged to, quote unquote, be a voter, not just to go vote. How does this appeal to identity factor in?
Yeah, so this isn't my research, but I love it. The argument is that once you see yourself as a voter, it becomes part of your identity. You're more likely to engage in that behavior. And then you carry that forward, right? It's not just an investment in getting someone to turn out and vote in one election. Once it becomes part of your identity, it's something you do again and again and again and again. I just did for my class, I just did a chart of if you've been alive for 4 years in Travis County, how many elections have you been through? 17. I know, right? The burden for voters in this country can be very high if you're a dedicated voter. And so having that sense of I am a voter as a part of my identity can help me turn out again and again and again and again. And it does.
Thank you so much. So this is going to be our second to last question.
Okay.
Did you do any studies of how anxiety levels change if voters believe their vote won't really have an effect? For example, someone voting for a Democratic candidate in a red state or vice versa.
Yeah, so there is research, it's not my research, but there is research that people who vote for winners tend to be happier. It makes sense, right? And Democrats were happier after 2018. Republicans were happier going into it. And I say happier, but I mean a range of negative emotions. Democrats had anxiety, anger, sadness, disgust. And then 2018, when the Democrats take over the House, they have a less negative emotion and more positive. The opposite for Republicans. It feels good to be on the winning side. The one caveat I want to mention, though, for the question is, does it feel better to be a Republican in Texas than a Democrat because it's likely the Republican will win, and the idea that your vote makes a difference? I tell my students who say, I'm a Democrat and my vote doesn't matter in Texas, say, well, you're in good company. Your Republican friend also doesn't really matter in Texas. Right? The idea that any one vote, and this is what we have to overcome in order to get young people to vote, but the idea that any one vote is going to switch the outcome of the election It can, it did in Virginia, right? I don't mean to say, but it's unlikely. Most of us are casting votes, and maybe they're more likely to vote matter down ballot, maybe, right? But mostly we're voting because it's a part of our identity. It's part of connecting with a group. It's something we do to honor people who fought for our rights to vote. The Republican in Texas isn't any more likely to cast the vote that makes the difference than the Democrat in Texas. The difference is some of us vote for winners and some of us vote for losers.
Okay. Last question.
Okay.
Tell us a bit about your plans for future research.
Oh, that's so nice. So some future research plans. I just got survey data yesterday, and I wanted to share some of it with you, but it's not cleaned up and it's not weighted yet. But I have 1,000-person sample in Texas and 1,000-person sample across the country. And we wanted to look at the relationship between, several things we want to look at, but the relationship between anxiety and support for vote by mail. If being anxious about COVID could overcome partisanship in terms of support for vote by mail. So that's one of the things we're looking at there. And then I'm really interested in these attitudes towards elections. I have questions about, when do you expect the election results to come out, right? A lot of us have been warning people this might not be election night, it may be election week. We have a number of, mail ballots, et cetera. And so I have questions on the survey about when you expect the results, whether you think the election will be contested, your level of faith in the election, and more of these democratic norms, because I'm really interested in both differences and how people view elections and our system as legitimate. And from there, what I'm really interested in is, how do we foster stronger democratic small d norms for this country?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Albertson. We really appreciate your time, as well as all of our attendees. Just a reminder to everyone to be a voter. In Texas, early voting has started. Personalized ballots can be found at vote411.org. Travis County residents can vote at any polling location between 7 and 7, Monday through Saturday, and Sundays from noon to 6 p.m. Please join us for the next On Course with Liberal Arts event next Tuesday, October 27th at noon for Elections 2020, What's Likely to Happen and What Does It Mean, with Dr. Sean Theriault. You can find more upcoming on-course events at the College of Liberal Arts website, and edited versions of all these talks are available on the college's YouTube page. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and hook 'em.